So picture this. It is February 28th, 2026.
Right.
And the United States and Israel launch what is basically a flawless, overwhelming military strike. I mean, we were talking about 900 precision strikes.
900. Yeah, in a matter of hours.
Exactly, in just hours. And this completely decapitates Iran's military and political leadership. Like, the command structure just shatters. The nuclear facilities are buried.
The radar arrays go totally dark.
Right. So by every single conventional metric of modern warfare, you look at this and say, well, that is a total victory.
Oh, absolutely. If you're looking at a traditional scorecard, it's a sweep.
But then, less than a week later, the entire global economy is collapsing. The U.S. dollar is suddenly losing its supremacy, and the NATO alliance is, like, actively tearing itself apart.
Yeah, and that right there is the core paradox of modern conflict.
Which is wild.
It is, because we still tend to conceptualize power in terms of, explosive yield or air superiority.
How many planes you have in the sky.
Exactly. But we live in a world where the absolute most devastating weapons out there aren't actually found in a missile silo anymore.
No.
No, they're found in the ledgers of global finance or the fine print of maritime insurance policies.
Wow.
And especially in the narrow geographic bottlenecks of global trade.
And that is exactly what we have for you today. Today, we have a fascinating deep dive for you. We're exploring a scenario that completely upends how we measure geopolitical power.
It really does.
We are going to unpack this incredibly detailed, highly speculative piece of geopolitical analysis. It's a conceptual blog post by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And it's written from a future perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's dated April 2026. So the mission for our deep dive today is to really trace the exact mechanics of how a localized military action, which the text dubs Operation Epic Fury, how that metastasizes instantly into this huge systemic global crisis.
A crisis that actively rewrites the rules of globalization.
Right. Globalization, supply chains, and frankly, the American empire itself.
But really quickly, right at the top, we want to be very clear with you, the listener.
Yes. Very important point here.
The political figures, the global policies, the specific military actions, and the nation states we are discussing today, they're being examined purely as concepts.
Just concepts presented in this specific source material.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints here. We aren't judging the ethics of these strategies.
Right, no taking sides.
No taking sides at all regarding any of the political ideologies or leaders mentioned, like U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for instance.
Right. We are acting strictly as your analytical guides through this very intense, highly complex geopolitical thought experiment.
Just mapping out the logic of the scenario.
Exactly. We're here to stress test it. Okay, let's unpack this. The inciting incident is massive.
Massive. A joint U.S. and Israeli shock and awe campaign.
Right. Like we said, nearly 1,000 coordinated, precision-guided munitions. They're striking missile sites, air defenses, leadership bunkers, all simultaneously.
The text even goes into the assassination of the supreme leader and dozens of senior officials.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you are sitting in the Pentagon or, the Kyria in Tel Aviv, you are looking at the satellite battle damage assessments and concluding that you have just definitively won the war.
You've certainly won the kinetic engagement. You've destroyed the hardware.
And eliminated the top of the organizational chart.
Right. But what this scenario illustrates so effectively is that destroying a nation's centralized military capacity doesn't actually neutralize its asymmetric leverage.
Which is the scary part.
It is. The true retaliation in this scenario didn't come in the form of a symmetric counterattack. They didn't just fire back a volley of missiles.
Right. They didn't just try to match the firepower.
No. The retaliation was the seizure of a narrow strip of water.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
Which, just for context, handles roughly 20% of the world's global oil trade.
A massive chunk of the global economy flows right through there.
But here is the critical distinction the text makes. Because Iran doesn't just, sink a bunch of tankers and physically block the strait.
Right, they don't create a maritime junkyard.
Yeah, they don't just blow things up to make a mess. They militarize it into a toll booth.
Yes. And the mechanism of that toll booth is what elevates this from a regional nuisance to a global systemic threat.
Wait till you hear this part.
They demand that transit fees for safe passage be paid specifically and exclusively in Chinese yuan.
When I read that, the mechanics of it just blew my mind. I mean, it's like someone locked the physical internet of global trade and is demanding crypto to let the data pass.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
It's basically a ransomware attack, but applied to physical geography.
What's fascinating here is how this action transforms geography into financial leverage.
It's so insidious.
It really is. Let's break down the actual mechanics of what is happening on the water. Say you are a Greek shipping magnate, okay?
Okay.
And your very large crude carrier, your VLCC, is sitting right there at the mouth of the Persian Gulf.
Loaded with oil.
Exactly. You cannot simply wire U.S. dollars to Tehran to pay this toll.
Right, because of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC.
Exactly. U.S. sanctions make it entirely illegal for any bank that touches the U.S. financial system to process that transaction.
So if a European bank or any allied bank tries to clear a dollar transaction to an Iranian entity,
they get locked out of the U.S. banking system.
which is basically a death sentence for a global bank.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So by demanding Chinese yuan, Iran is forcing these shipping companies to bypass the SWIFT messaging system entirely.
They can't use the normal pipes.
Right. They have to route their payments through China's alternative system, which is the cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS.
Wait, let me stop you there. Because, practically speaking, how is that even enforced in real time?
It's a logistical nightmare.
Right, like a U.S.-aligned tanker isn't going to just easily set up a CIPS account overnight. So are Iranian forces, like, physically boarding the ships to check receipts, or is this happening through proxy banks in Beijing?
It happens through escrow and proxy structures, mostly out of jurisdictions that don't recognize unilateral U.S. sanctions.
Oh, I see.
So the shipping company has to desperately call up a broker in Hong Kong or Shanghai, purchase millions in yuan, and transfer it to an approved account.
All while the ship is just sitting there.
Sitting there, yeah.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Iranian fast attack craft and drones are shadowing the vessel.
Just looming over them.
Exactly. And the implicit threat is broadcast over the maritime VHF radio. They say, confirm payment via our designated clearinghouse, or you will be targeted as a hostile vessel.
Wow. It's literal extortion, enforced by the threat of loitering munitions.
And it fundamentally changes the currency of passage.
The text actually says it's a political statement carved into the hull of every tanker that passes.
That's a great line.
Yeah, the message is super clear. America may dominate the airspace with stealth bombers, but China is positioning itself to dominate the global leisure.
Exactly. It forces Western-aligned corporations to actively participate in the de-dollarization of the global economy.
Just to keep their businesses alive.
Right. And it funds the Iranian asymmetric war effort. It punishes Western-aligned economies with friction and delay.
And actively chips away at the U.S. dollar's monopoly. All in one elegant, devastating move.
It's geopolitical judo.
So how does a financial toll booth in the Middle East immediately trigger a cascading economic crisis thousands of miles away?
Because it hits the very foundation of modern life.
Because the text doesn't just keep this in the realm of high-level geopolitical theory, right?
Yeah.
It traces the immediate economic shockwaves, what it calls a heart attack at the Strait.
Yeah. And the immediate symptom of that heart attack, of course, is the price of crude oil.
Brent crude just spikes violently.
Futures markets panic. They move into extreme backwardation.
Which basically means the price of oil today is vastly more expensive than the price of oil delivered months from now, right?
Exactly, because everyone is terrified of an immediate physical shortage. They need the oil now.
Right. We all know that oil spikes cause inflation. You know, gas in the U.S. crosses $4 or $5 a gallon.
Localized fuel shortages hit.
Yeah. But for you listening, we need to remember that oil isn't just what fuels your commute.
Oh, not at all.
It's in the fertilizer for the food you eat. It's the plastics in your home. It's the packaging for your medicine. It is literally the shipping mechanism for every single online order you receive.
Globalization is a machine built on cheap fuel, and its most delicate component is shipping.
And the text zeroes in on a terrifying secondary mechanism here, specifically looking at the Global South.
This is where the macroeconomic analysis in the scenario gets incredibly dark.
Yeah, we're not just talking about Americans complaining about expensive gas. We are talking about the complete collapse of sovereign subsidies.
Consider a country like Egypt or Nigeria.
Yeah.
They rely heavily on dollar reserves to subsidize basic necessities for their populations. Food, transportation, domestic fuel.
Right, to keep the social contract intact so
Yeah.
people can afford to live.
Exactly. But when the global price of oil spikes to, say, $150 or $200 a barrel because Hormuz is choked off,
Those dollar reserves just burn out.
in a matter of weeks. But it's actually a double shock.
How so?
Because during a global geopolitical crisis, international capital flees to safety.
Oh, right. Investors panic.
Yes, they dump emerging market currencies and they buy U.S. treasuries.
Ah. So the local currency of that developing nation collapses in value right at the exact moment the commodity they desperately need to import oil skyrockets in price.
Precisely. They are hit from both sides. They need more dollars to buy the oil, but their own currency buys fewer dollars.
So the subsidies just collapse overnight.
The government simply cannot afford to absorb the cost anymore, so they pass it on to the consumer.
And suddenly the price of bread triples,
The cost of a bus ticket to get to work quadruples.
which leads to immediate social unrest. I mean, it has to. The text points out that fuel inflation is the ultimate stark.
It really is.
It argues that a war in the Middle East instantly translates into a bread riot in Africa, a currency crisis in South Asia, a massive protest wave in Latin America.
It highlights that a barrel of oil isn't just an economic commodity. It is a sovereign destabilizer.
Wow.
A barrel of oil can topple a government far faster than a military battalion ever could.
Because when the basic caloric and transport needs of a population are suddenly unaffordable, regimes fall.
The scenario emphasizes that energy markets are the ultimate transmission mechanism for geopolitical pain.
Which begs the critical question, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the stakes are this high and the global economy is bleeding out, why can't the most powerful military in the history of the world simply force the system back to normal?
It seems like they should be able to, right?
I mean, yeah. The text establishes that the U.S. and Israel just shattered Iran's command structure. They have absolute air superiority. They have super carriers parked right there in the region.
To understand that, we really have to look deeply into the nature of maritime choke points and the concept of asymmetric power.
Let's dive into that, because the source compares the Strait of Hormuz to the Suez Canal. Specifically, it brings up that 2021 incident with the Ever Given. You know, that massive container ship that got stuck sideways and jammed up global trade for days.
It's a really useful comparison, but the author makes a vital distinction here.
Which is?
The Suez blockage was a commercial accident. It was just a traffic jam caused by wind and human error.
Yeah, once the ship was dislodged, traffic just resumed normally.
Exactly. But Hormuz, in this scenario, is an active hostage situation.
And this is where I want to push back on the military logic of the scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
Wait. The U.S. has carrier strike groups. They have Aegis combat systems, satellite surveillance, massive drone fleets. If Iran's conventional military was just neutralized, decapitated, why is the U.S. struggling to clear a single waterway?
It's a fair question.
How can a fractured, decapitated military hold the entire global economy hostage against a superpower?
Because protecting a global supply chain requires an entirely different operational tempo than destroying a static target.
Okay, unpack that.
To protect a strait, a superpower needs massive fleets, continuous air patrols, perfect intelligence. They need the ability to intercept dozens of simultaneous threats 24/7.
They essentially need a 100% success rate.
Exactly. But to disrupt that same choke point, you don't need a massive navy. You don't need a centralized command structure at all.
You just need to break things sporadically.
Exactly. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare.
And the text lists the tools they use for this, right?
Yes. Smart sea mines deployed by decentralized proxy groups.
Low-flying suicide drones.
Anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from, like, mobile launchers hidden in the mountains.
Swarms of fast attack speedboats.
And here's the kicker. Even if the U.S. Navy shoots down 99% of the incoming threats, that 1% that gets through is enough to completely spook the markets.
And the source points out that globalization is heavily reliant on these geographic pressure valves. It's not just Hormuz.
Right, there are several.
It's the Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia. It's Bab el-Mandeb connecting the Red Sea, the Panama Canal, the Turkish Straits.
The overarching lesson here is that globalization is only as strong as its narrowest choke point.
But the truly brilliant insight from the analysis isn't even about physical weapons like drones or sea mines.
No, it's about how those physical weapons trigger an entirely invisible weapon.
Marine insurance.
Yes. The underlying thesis here is that modern wars aren't just fought with bombs, they are fought with actuaries and spreadsheets.
This part of the text absolutely fascinated me. The argument is that Iran doesn't actually need to sink a fleet of tankers to shut down the strait.
They don't even need to hit one ship successfully.
Right? Only need to make the risk models collapse.
Exactly.
Right. So let's explain the mechanics of this because it's crucial for you to understand. How does the marine insurance market actually dictate global trade?
Well, it revolves around institutions like Lloyd's of London.
Okay.
And specifically the Joint War Committee, the JWC.
What do they do?
The JWC assesses global maritime risks and designates certain waters as listed areas.
Like a danger zone.
Right. If a commercial vessel wants to sail into a listed area, like the Persian Gulf during an active conflict, their standard insurance policy is completely voided.
Just canceled.
Yep. They have to purchase what's called a breach premium, or an additional premium, an AP.
And that premium is calculated as a percentage of the total value of the ship's hull, right?
Correct. It's called the hull war premium. So imagine a modern VLCC carrying 2 million barrels of oil.
A huge ship.
Massive. The ship itself might be worth $100 million, and the cargo is worth another $200 million.
Okay, so 300 million total value floating out there.
Right. Now, in peacetime, that additional premium might be a 0.02% of the hull's value.
Which is basically a rounding error for these companies.
Exactly. But in this scenario, with missiles flying and a superpower conflict underway, the actuaries at Lloyd's might spike that premium to 5% or 10%.
Oh, wow.
Or they might just refuse to underwrite the voyage entirely.
Which means the shipping company suddenly has to pay $5 million or $10 million in cash up front just for the insurance policy for a single week-long transit.
And that completely destroys the profit margin of the voyage.
So they just don't go.
The shipping companies simply won't sail. I mean, they can handle longer routes around the Cape of Good Hope. They can handle higher bunker fuel costs.
But they absolutely cannot operate if the protection and indemnity clubs, the P&I clubs that insure against environmental disasters and liability, pull their coverage.
If the insurance drops, the ships stop, period.
It's incredible. The global economy isn't actually built on the physical steel of the ships. It's built entirely on the psychological confidence of the insurance underwriters.
Exactly. Insurance becomes a multiplier of fear.
Wow.
A single drone intercepted near a commercial vessel forces a recalibration of a risk model in London.
And that instantly halts millions of barrels of oil from leaving the Gulf.
Right. Iran achieves a total blockade without having a navy capable of enforcing one. They weaponize the Western financial risk models against the West itself.
Which brings us to the geopolitical fallout. Because this economic and geographic weaponization isn't just hurting global markets.
No, it goes much deeper.
It's actively tearing apart the historic political alliances that have defined the post-World War II era.
The very foundation of Western unity.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The source details the real-time fracturing of the transatlantic alliance. NATO is cracking under the pressure.
The political fallout in this scenario is arguably more severe than the economic shock, because it deals with the structural integrity of the Western world.
The text describes European governments pushing back incredibly hard against the U.S. and Israeli operations.
They are terrified of the spillover.
Right. They're citing massive escalation risks. They're raising legal concerns over strikes hitting dual-use infrastructure.
And it gets worse. You have NATO members reportedly withholding logistical support.
Denying airspace.
Yes, or quietly moving their naval assets out of the U.S. coalition's command structure.
Just subtly backing away.
Exactly. And this friction culminates in a deeply revealing quote from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio within the scenario.
Right. The text notes that Rubio openly suggests Washington may need to re-examine ties with NATO after the conflict,
implying that European allies are acting as free riders who lack the stomach for hard security decisions.
And the author points out that this kind of language, openly questioning the utility of NATO during an active global crisis, that would have been utterly unthinkable for an American administration in the late 20th century.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the scenario is exposing a profound structural imbalance in the transatlantic alliance.
How so?
Well, when Washington launches a preemptive or retaliatory war in the Middle East, what is the actual distribution of consequences?
The U.S. gets the strategic victory, the domestic political bump, and the press conferences.
Yes, but Europe gets the refugees and the economic devastation.
Precisely. The text lays this out so starkly. Europe absorbs the vast majority of the spillover.
Because of pure geography, they are the destination for the refugee flows.
And because of their reliance on imported energy, they suffer the most severe industrial shocks when Hormuz closes.
Berlin and Paris have to deal with the immediate domestic terror risks and the mass protests, not Washington.
So when Washington acts unilaterally, even if it's a tactically brilliant military strike, Europe feels the pain first, and they feel it hardest.
Which fundamentally changes the nature of the agreement.
The author argues that if the U.S. begins treating NATO purely as an instrument for its own unilateral power projection, rather than a consensus-driven partnership,
It stops being a sacred defense covenant.
it becomes a transactional arrangement, an optional subscription service that America can just cancel or threaten to cancel at will.
And the text asks a brutal existential question. If NATO's strongest member acts unilaterally and disregards the economic collateral damage inflicted on its allies, is NATO still NATO or merely a legacy logo?
Ouch. Merely a legacy logo. It's a chilling institutional critique.
It really is. And the scenario doesn't stop with NATO, by the way.
Right, it turns its analytical lens to the United Nations. It describes the UN Security Council as a theater without teeth.
That UN metaphor in the text is incredibly evocative.
It is. The scenario describes the Security Council convening in these emergency sessions. Draft resolutions are floated, fiery speeches are made, condemnations are issued.
But the author coldly notes that none of it intercepts a single ballistic missile or clears a single sea mine.
Because of the structural paralysis embedded in the UN's DNA.
Exactly. The veto power held by the permanent members, specifically the opposing strategic interests of the U.S., China, and Russia, guarantees that the institution cannot act decisively in a great power conflict.
The UN basically becomes a diplomatic stage rather than a governing body, a microphone, not a mechanism.
Right. And the quote that really anchors this segment of the text is just devastating.
Remind me.
It says, "The UN today resembles an emergency room where the doctors are arguing over paperwork while the patient bleeds out on the floor."
Oh, man. It perfectly captures this systemic fatigue.
Absolutely.
The institutions built for the 1945 world order, which were designed to prevent massive land wars between mechanized armies, they're simply breaking under the strain of decentralized warfare, economic coercion, and weaponized supply chains.
So if the traditional pillars of Western stability, NATO and the UN, are paralyzed or fracturing, how do the rising powers respond?
Good question.
Because the text dives deep into the shifting allegiances of the non-Western world, starting with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC.
The fortress kingdoms, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the nations that sit directly across the Gulf from this conflict.
The scenario points out that these Gulf monarchies are suddenly living inside the very war they have spent decades trying to manage from a distance through proxy conflicts.
It's just terrifying reality for them.
Yeah. Despite massive investments in Western air defense systems, Iranian missiles and proxy drones are targeting Gulf infrastructure.
And even if the Patriot and Blade batteries intercept 95% of them, the psychological environment is shattered.
The text talks about the death of the stability premium.
And this is vital to understand because it attacks the core of their future economic survival.
Exactly. Look at Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 or the economic model of Dubai.
Right. These are massive, multi-trillion-dollar bets on transitioning away from oil dependency.
They require massive foreign direct investment, tourism, and expatriate talent. They want to be the new global hubs for tech and finance.
But the author puts it perfectly. No investor wants to build a Silicon Valley on top of a missile range.
You can't attract global venture capital to NEOM if the airspace is closed due to loitering munitions.
The Gulf's long-term grand strategy, their attempt to hedge their bets by maintaining U.S. security guarantees while deeply integrating with the Chinese economy, it just collapses the moment they have to choose a side.
They are physically trapped.
Which brings us to the BRICS coalition. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Now, you might assume, looking at a surface-level analysis, that this chaos is a pure strategic windfall for them, a golden opportunity to finally overthrow Western hegemony.
But the text is much more rigorous than that. It calls this the BRICS illusion.
The war certainly energizes the anti-Western rhetoric of the BRICS nations, but it simultaneously exposes their deep internal contradictions.
Let's look at China first. Publicly, Beijing plays the role of the responsible global stakeholder. They call for an immediate ceasefire, they condemn unilateral military action, and they frame the U.S. strikes as reckless imperialism.
But quietly, behind closed doors.
Yeah.
The text argues China is reaping the strategic leverage of those yuan-denominator tolls in Hormuz. It is a massive forced acceleration of their long-term goal to internationalize their currency.
Meanwhile, Russia utilizes the conflict entirely for narrative and diplomatic dominance.
Moscow's overarching storyline to the Global South is immensely strengthened. They argue that the so-called rules-based international order is a myth.
Right. The West doesn't enforce rules, they enforce obedience.
Exactly. When the U.S. wants to bomb a sovereign nation, they just do it. Russia points to the smoldering ruins in Iran and says, look, Western power is purely coercive. We offer an alternative.
But wait, I need to stop you there. This is where I have to challenge the scenario's assumption that this is a net win for Beijing or Moscow.
Okay, let's explore that.
Let's look at the mechanics.
Yeah.
If China is the factory of the world, their entire economic machine runs on imported energy, specifically oil from the Middle East.
Right.
Furthermore, their economy relies on exporting manufactured goods to Europe and the U.S. If oil goes to $150 a barrel, doesn't that crush China's manufacturing base?
It definitely puts a massive strain on it.
And if Europe is in an energy depression, China loses its primary customer. How does a closed Strait of Hormuz actually help Beijing in the long run? Is the yuan toll strategy a double-edged sword?
That is the exact vulnerability the text touches upon when it discusses the illusion. Multipolarity is incredibly volatile for everyone, including the challengers.
Right.
China might gain currency leverage, but they suffer massive macroeconomic headwinds. And it's even worse for the middle powers in the BRICS coalition, like India and Brazil.
I kept thinking of an analogy while reading this section. It's like India and Brazil are passengers in a speeding car, where the drivers, the U.S. and the China-Russia bloc, are violently fighting over the steering wheel.
That's a great image.
The passengers don't want to crash. They just want to get to their destination safely. They want what they call strategic autonomy.
But instead, they find themselves trapped in the back seat.
Yeah. India's entire macroeconomic growth model depends absolutely on cheap, reliable, imported energy. They desperately need the oil flowing through Hormuz.
But simultaneously, they need access to Western technology, Western capital markets, and U.S. defense cooperation to counterbalance China in the Himalayas.
Exactly. The author emphasizes that BRICS is not a monolithic alliance like NATO. It's a loose coalition of overlapping grievances and competing ambitions.
Higher energy prices punish almost all of them except Russia.
So in a divided world, neutrality becomes an incredibly expensive luxury.
You want to remain non-aligned, but when the missiles start flying and the straits are mined, you are forced by sheer economic gravity to pick a side.
It produces leverage for a few, but immense volatility for everyone.
So what does this all mean?
This brings us to the ultimate question posed by the source material. When the kinetic strikes stop, when the dust finally settles, how does the global system adapt so this kind of hostage situation never happens again?
Because the author doesn't just leave us in the chaos. They project how global supply chains and the international financial architecture will permanently alter in response to this trauma.
They look at the long game.
And the first major structural shift is a fundamental rethinking of physical logistics.
Okay, so how does that look?
Well, for the last 40 years, the global economy has been ruthlessly optimized for efficiency and cost reduction. The text refers to the just-in-time supply chain.
Built like a tightrope. No inventory, no warehousing. Parts arrive exactly when the assembly line needs them.
It's incredibly profitable, but it assumes a baseline of perfect global peace.
Which, obviously, we don't have here.
Yes, but this crisis forces a massive, agonizing shift from just-in-time to just-in-case logistics.
The author unpacks what a truly de-risked world looks like. And the primary takeaway is that a de-risked world is an intensely expensive world.
We are talking about the massive reshoring of critical manufacturing back to North America and Europe.
Nearshoring to Mexico and Eastern Europe.
Mandating redundant suppliers for critical minerals and pharmaceuticals. You can't just rely on one factory in Asia anymore.
And critically, it involves astronomical, long-term capital investments in alternative energy and transport routes, designed specifically to bypass maritime choke points altogether.
The text mentions the acceleration of overland pipeline projects like the ones China is already building from Russia and Central Asia to ensure energy security that cannot be interdicted by the U.S. Navy.
And it also highlights the strategic pivot toward Arctic shipping lanes. The source points out that as climate change accelerates the melting of the polar ice, the northern sea route becomes increasingly viable year-round.
It's shorter, And crucially, it avoids the Middle East entirely.
Of course, it runs right through Russia's exclusive economic zone, which carries its own massive geopolitical complications.
But the point the text is making is that countries will look at the Arctic as a necessary escape hatch from places like Hormuz and Malacca.
Globalization isn't ending, but it is fragmenting. It's becoming less global, more regional, heavily militarized, and vastly more expensive for the end consumer.
But the deepest, most permanent underlying shift the author identifies isn't about physical ships or icebreakers or pipelines.
No.
It's the acceleration of the financial war. It's the weaponization of the ledger.
The text describes the U.S. dollar as America's nervous system.
That is the core conceptual anchor of the entire scenario.
The U.S. dollar's absolute dominance as the global reserve currency, the fact that central banks hold it, commodities are priced in it, and global debt is issued in it, is the true source of American hegemony.
It's what allows the U.S. government to run massive deficits, borrow money cheaply, fund a globe-spanning military, and most importantly, enforce global compliance through the power of economic sanctions.
The author brilliantly frames the dollar as the hidden aircraft carrier.
The hidden aircraft carrier, I love that phrasing.
Just like a nuclear carrier group projects physical power and deters aggression through the threat of kinetic force, the U.S. Treasury projects legal power.
It forces foreign governments and multinational banks to comply with American foreign policy or risk being cut off from the global clearinghouses.
Exactly. So when Iran, backed implicitly by Chinese financial infrastructure, forces global shipping companies to pay transit tolls in yuan, it is not merely about collecting revenue.
It is a slow, methodical, proof-of-concept erosion of that financial monopoly.
It creates a closed loop of demand for a non-dollar currency.
Precisely. The author states that China's grand strategy isn't about achieving a dramatic, decisive military victory over the U.S. Navy in the Pacific.
It's much more insidious than that.
It's about creating structural inevitability. They want to build a parallel, sanction-proof financial ecosystem.
By forcing the internationalization of the yuan through chokepoint extortion, they are engineering a world where the global economy simply relies less on the dollar.
And as dollar reliance drops, U.S. coercive power becomes vastly less enforceable.
So even if the U.S. and Israel decisively win the kinetic military battle, even if they successfully destroy every single missile silo, drone factory, command bunker, and nuclear centrifuge in Iran,
do they actually lose strategically if the world abandons the dollar and American-led institutions in the chaotic aftermath?
this raises an important question, perhaps the most vital question of the entire analysis. How do you measure victory in the 21st century?
The author concludes that strategic victory is no longer measured in targets destroyed or airspace controlled. It is measured exclusively by the structural realities of the world that emerges afterward.
And if that post-war world features shattered trust within NATO, permanently higher global inflation due to de-risked supply chains, an accelerated transition away from the U.S. dollar, a completely discredited United Nations, and a normalized era of chokepoint extortion,
Then the United States has won a brilliant tactical battle, but fundamentally weakened the foundations of its own empire.
because, as the author astutely points out, drawing on centuries of historical precedent, global empires do not typically collapse from a single catastrophic military defeat.
They collapse from imperial overextension, they collapse from a gradual loss of moral and institutional legitimacy.
And most importantly, they collapse from systemic fatigue, when the cost of maintaining the architecture of the empire simply exceeds the economic benefits it produces.
When their systems stop producing stability at a reasonable cost, the hegemony fails.
It is an incredibly sobering, meticulously argued analysis.
It really makes you think.
To summarize the profound geopolitical shift detailed in this 2026 scenario, the author is telling us that the world has fully transitioned from the predictable, unipolar order anchored by American military and financial might into a fiercely contested, multipolar landscape.
But it's not a stable, balanced multipolarity like the Cold War.
No, the text explicitly calls it a knife fight in a crowded room.
A world where there is no longer a recognized global referee.
A systemic shift where nations and proxy groups no longer ask, is this action legal under international law? But rather purely, do I have the asymmetric leverage to get away with it?
Geography has returned as destiny.
For the last 30 years, we convinced ourselves that the internet, fiber optic cables, and frictionless global supply chains had made borders, distance, and physical geography irrelevant.
But this scenario proves that human civilization still runs on physical pathways. Oil must move through straits. Microchips must cross oceans.
The text makes it crystal clear.
Yeah.
Military dominance, having the most advanced stealth bombers and the biggest hammer, is no longer enough to guarantee global stability.
True global power now lies in controlling the geographic bottlenecks, weaponizing the risk models, and writing the financial ledgers.
It's a dark preview of the operating system for a new, immensely more volatile era of human civilization.
It truly is.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought. It's inspired by a very brief, almost throwaway question the author poses near the end of the text.
Oh, the cyber attack point.
Yeah. The author asks, will Iran unleash cyber attacks on Western infrastructure?
Right.
We spent this entire deep dive talking about physical, geographic choke points, narrow strips of saltwater, canals, straits, pipelines. We've talked about the kinetic threat of sea mines and drones.
But consider the logical evolution of this strategy.
If seizing a physical choke point like Hormuz can cause a global economic heart attack and rewrite the global financial order, what happens when the next choke point seized isn't a body of water at all?
What if the choke point is entirely digital?
Exactly. What happens when the target isn't a ship, but the automatic identification system, the AIS spoofing that guides them?
What happens when a state-sponsored hacker group targets the proprietary routing software that manages the container cranes in the port of Los Angeles or Rotterdam?
Or the cloud infrastructure that processes the very marine insurance risk models we just spent 20 minutes discussing?
Could the next world-stopping embargo, the next total paralysis of the global supply chain, happen without firing a single physical shot, deploying a single fast attack boat, or risking a single soldier?
Are we prepared to navigate a multipolar world where the most dangerous choke point isn't on a map, but hidden in the code that runs the world?
That is the ultimate test of systemic resilience. We are guarding the straits, but the architecture itself might be the real battlefield.
It's a terrifying paradigm shift. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a profoundly complex, challenging vision of the geopolitical future. We will leave you to ponder the implications of that invisible digital strait. Until next time.